Penguin Random House Canada presents Everything and Nothing at All, Essays by Heijun Wills. Read for you by the author. 4S, 4K, 4C. Take my whole life, too. Departure. I have a secret. It could cause a mild scandal amongst my colleagues at the university. I might be promptly evicted from the few adoptee groups and Asian Canadian communities that have hesitatingly accepted me. It has the potential to do more damage, this confession, than good. But here goes. Sometimes knowledge, sometimes knowing things, is not only unhelpful, it's harmful. Maybe even hurtful. A strike, a stab, a wound. This includes knowledge of intellectual concepts, disciplines, fields of study, theories, and practices, but also knowledge of ourselves, our origins, our people. It's more than the weaponization of so-called formal knowledge, the power discrepancy between the studiers and the studied. The unforgiving ways that to know is infused with classist, ableist, racist, sexist, and colonialist dynamics of access and ownership. It is the risks, sometimes the rewards, but, from my experience, often the regrets of knowing too much that shape each of the essays that follow. Because disappointment cannot be unknown. Nor can grief, tragedy, or, frankly, love, pleasure, joy. How easily these things collapse into one another bewilders. For me, it's what renders me liminal, in between, as well as its opposite, in excess. I'll give you what is perhaps an obvious example. I am a transracially and transnationally adopted person who spent the majority of my life searching for answers about myself, about my family in Korea, about the parts of my identity that came from genetics, so I could figure out the parts that came from socialization, having been raised in white, Southern Ontario, Canada. I was desperate to know how my biological kin looked, what they sounded like, why and how they could ever let me go, if they understood or cared about the damage resulting from me having grown up in complete racial isolation and cultural fracture. Then I met them, my Korean family, that is, and it was marvelous at first. They were excited to call me daughter or granddaughter or niece or sister, until they weren't. And surrounded by my Korean family, but also a growing breadth of knowledge, I came to realize just how vulnerable thinking, overthinking, and rethinking made me. I learned things about strangers I loved through blood only. Things I wish I hadn't. Things impossible to overcome. Eventually, I recognized the emotional harm I willingly tolerated again and again because one adoptee rite of passage might be the refusal of the white savior narrative. But another could be the acceptance that biological kin can never live up to the myth of themselves. A myth we've had an entire childhood and beyond to invent. Knowing them, knowing about my origins, knowing who my Korean family became and how incompatible our lives really were, left me untethered. It hurts. Knowing they are out there, knowing they still don't want me after meeting me as an adult, hurts. Chasing after some people and at once running away from others, adopters, social workers, apologists, etc., hurts. But that was the chance I understood I was taking. The acceptance that a surplus of information, the belief that it is a human right to know one's origins, to which I still ascribe, was always a risk. And while, for me, This kind of knowledge has always been laced with panic over the fragility of any holdable connection to those people and my personal information. Searching for them and answers about my past was inevitable. It was also reckless. Because, before that, I already knew that I didn't fit into my white family. Not in the facile way my Canadian parents had been promised I would. I knew that I wouldn't or couldn't talk to them about race, that it was more a treacherous tripwire than topics of gender and sexuality were and continue to be. I knew from a very early age what was safe, who was being protected by whom, and how to orchestrate our kinship so that we might all make it through intact. In the process, I grew angry the more I dislodged the shrapnel of my early life, the landmine of acknowledging racial shame and the desperation of trying to diffuse it alone and in time. But I also came to learn that one's politics and personal beliefs may push an individual hard in one direction, yet, on the ground, in the heart, it is not so simple. And so, with no emotional liberation after my reunion and ongoing stress around certain issues within my adoptive family, with what was I left? The knowledge that I didn't belong anywhere. I don't belong to or with anyone. Not in the traditional sense, that is. I've longed to live here in this inarticulate space, to embrace multiplicity instead of ache for singularity, multidirectionality in lieu of linearity. I've also learned that sometimes people are mean. Sometimes they save your life. And sometimes you have to put your own trauma in a box on a shelf and protect people and things more precarious and precious than your own sense of existence. At different times in my life, I turned to various kinds of teachings, hoping to ground myself because everyone else's efforts to anchor me to anything inevitably felt detached. Conventional resources, books, lectures, visual media, supplemented limited experience and disconnection from my racial kin. I read with a clear, theoretical eye. I felt things strongly, but somehow intellectual and life knowledge remained isolated. Maybe it was fear or some other incoherence that kept those lessons separate and unbraided in my mind. So what were the options? I told myself I was in control, as I'd lied my entire life. Nearly convinced myself that heart and head should be distanced. Ignorance is not bliss, but it surely was a convenient disguise. In the essays that follow, I've attempted to combine experiential recognition with intellectual thought, hoping to build a different kind of knowledge homecoming more suited to the person I've come to be. Life encounters that are at times terrible, at times a celebration, but are mostly something in between or beyond, understood through a carefully curated ensemble of interpretations, some my own, but more often those of scholars, activists, artists, and thinkers I admire. Each of these essays poses more questions than it provides answers on themes of racial beauty, linguistic grief, transracial and transnational adoption, pansexuality and polyamory, and violences perpetrated by ourselves and others. Most of all, these essays encourage love, but ponder why and if it is possible, how and when it is knowable, secure. Adopted communities have a saying: when we start questioning the story that we've been saved from our biological fate, we pronounce that we are coming out of the fog, where the fog, I suppose, is the false narrative that adoption is a solution to suffering and not an instigator in and of itself. To emerge from the fog is to arrive at the knowledge of some capital T truth about our lives. It's an imperfect metaphor, since it is linear and permanent. It's teleological. But what strikes me as most ironic is that it is dichotomous. By that I mean, there is an assumption of being in and being out of.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?